of things, as you say. We travel the country, we provide resources, we host online communities, but it's all really in one effort, and that is to help people who have shaped their understanding of themselves due to their political and religious identity. And that's what evangelicalism is and does. Evangelicalism, kind of like Catholicism, and they're similar in this way. They're really not religious and theological categories. They're sociocultural categories.
Oh,
so when you meet someone and they say, "Hey, I'm a Catholic," you don't often say to them, "Hey, let's chat a little bit about your theology of the Mother Mary," right? They're like, "Nah, I don't actually think about that stuff at all." Or if you even say, "Well, what parish are you involved in?" They might say, "Oh, I haven't gone to church for years, but I'm Catholic." We understand this with Jewish communities. We understand this with Muslim communities as well, that religion tends to do this, but especially Catholics and evangelicals. And that's what's confusing to a lot of people about evangelicals particularly. They think that it's religion that is the framing narrative when someone identifies as an evangelical. Now, I'm not saying these people are not religious. They certainly are. There's definitely a religious component, but it's fundamentally a worldview or a sociocultural category that people are using. And this is one of the things that for people who don't understand or are not engaged in religion like this, have a hard time grasping, is that if religion isn't one of your identity formation components, then you see religion as a thing that you choose, like you would choose, other ways to be involved in society. Like, well, I know I grew up with my dad being a Cleveland, baseball fan, so I kind of choose that too. But I also root for the Red Sox. It's like that. And so they think that people choose their religion because there's something of value there. Or they think they choose it because there's something beneficial. Every once in a while, that's true. But that's not who we work with. We work with people for whom they've been shaped and formed in a cultural frame that is evangelical. And then with that comes all these other add-ons, which is just true of every cultural norm, right? That's what culture does. So I've approached all this work more from a cultural anthropology or sociological view of how a person's personal engagement with a culture, with a set of cultural norms, is formed. And that's where we're trying to help people move, because what we know is that cultural norms tend to shift, and when they do, people go through a lot of struggle, and so culture is never static. It's always adapting and changing, and so we think that there's a set of people for whom they've been shaped with evangelicalism and Catholicism. They're slightly different, so we treat them a little bit differently, but they're similar in the sense that they have a frame of reference to their lives. And we help those people detach their political identity from the rest of this cultural frame and shaping. And that's super, super important. We're not trying to get people to not be Catholics. We're not trying to get people to not be evangelicals. We like to joke that the religion does enough of that work on its own, right? Like, and I'm an evangelical pastor, so I get it. Like, you feel all the time like, man, why do I even hold on to this faith any longer? And it's because the tentacles of it are so tied together in your sense of how you view the world and how you understand it, that even if you stop going and you renounce your faith completely, there's still this set of patterns that stays in place because it's shaped your culture. You almost can't unravel yourself from it.
Can you say something about what those cultural norms are? I mean, give something of a picture of that.
Yeah, for a lot of people, one of the things they look for in their culture shaping elements is something that helps them understand if they're a good person or not. So being a good person is really important to a lot of people, right?
Yes.
And their religion, which is a cultural shaping force, gives indications about how to be a good person or not. That's why we call our organization Vote Common Good, right? Because we're trying to tap into that thing where we're like, we know you want to be good. And sometimes we even joke, come election week, 6 out of 7 days you act in really good ways. So why on election day do you break all that and do something different, right? So we're trying to contrast their very best goodness with, why do you have this identity that now has you doing things where you feel like you're plugging your nose to still vote for Donald Trump or a Republican or something? Like you feel like you're violating your sense of goodness somewhere, and we just want to help you resolve that. So being good is a super important piece of this, and also understanding yourself in the milieu of all the changes in culture and society, right? Like, where do you find your sense of community, and who are the people that you move with? How do you locate yourself? And so really those two things are the most, I don't know if they tend to be the most powerful. Most things come back to one of those two things, right? These are my people, and I'm not going to be alone. I promise you that. I hear this so often from people, they're just like, young people, in their 20s, and people in the mid raising children years, and especially older people. It is really it's really a thing. And so, and then I'll say that the third element is that so many of these people don't see themselves fundamentally as political. So when you start talking about politics, they're like, hey man, I'm not political. Like, don't even, and then you drill down a little deeper, and they definitely are, but by their own definition, because part of being a good person who's in a community is that you have higher values than just a political identity. So we did a series of interviews with people in 2019, in 2020, when the pandemic caused us to stop doing a lot of our other work. We launched a little project called Hindsight 2020. So we wanted to interview religious voters, especially evangelicals, white evangelicals, who voted for Trump in 2016, but were not going to vote for Trump in 2020, primarily because of their faith. So these are people who deepened into their faith between 2016 and 2020, and because of that said, I can't vote for the guy again. And lots of particulars in there about who we were talking about and looking for, right? We didn't want people who had said, I was really religious in 2016. I bagged all that in 2018. And, so now I'm willing to vote for a Democrat, right? Because, now I'm freed from my religious obligation. That's good. People do that all the time. We help those folks too. But we were interested in the people for whom they became more connected to their faith, or their faith mattered more deeply to them 4 years later. And what was that move? And to a person, they all said, and it was almost like, and we interviewed people all over the country, different ages, men, women, but all their stories had a very similar pattern to them. So we started to pick up a pattern. And one of the pattern pieces was, I'm not political. And then we'd ask them, like, have you ever voted for someone who's not a Republican? No, I've never not voted for a Republican, but I'm not political in that same way, right? So there's something where there's a way to narrate your story, that you're a good person, you're doing the heroic thing inside your community, and you're not being bossed around by the political forces. When someone comes to realization that any one of those four is not actually the heroic piece, yeah.
What do you mean by the heroic part?
Because your religion gives you a narrative of how you're a good person, then your job is to act in ways that are good when other people are acting in ways that aren't.
Got it.
So very often, and this was particular to voting for Donald Trump, but I think it's broader than that. They would say things like, look, I didn't want to vote for Donald Trump, but I couldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. Like somehow she had become this image of something so diabolical that I had to do the heroic thing in voting for Donald Trump. So the story they had in their heads wasn't, I did a bad thing voting for Trump. I did the heroic thing in 2016 because I couldn't vote for her. But now I've realized that really wasn't the choice I should have made. Now I'm going to do the next heroic thing and not vote for him again. So it was really interesting listening to people. And, we all, as a pastor and a kind of a cultural sociologist, I pay attention to this. I'm sure in your field, you all see it even more deeply. It's just amazing how we can make ourselves, like there's always a hero and there's always a victim.
Right.
And so we'll put ourselves in one of those two categories. We just certainly don't want to put ourselves in the perpetrator category or the villain, right? So if there's three groups, you're either going to be the victim, the hero, or the hero. You're never the perpetrator or the villain. So once people realize, oh man, I think I might have fallen from the hero category in my action to maybe I did something that was wrong. And we, we're not asking people to explain themselves, because you don't have to, because you can't. Like, who can explain any decision any of us make? Like, it's a myriad, thing. But what was interesting is that people saw themselves as acting heroically on what they knew was good inside of a community that gave them meaning. And then they left that community, and they broke a community norm, and they had to navigate, how much cost were they willing to pay. So that's the work we do. Is we don't try to convince people that voting for that Republicans are bad, or that Donald Trump is bad. We have this little joke in our world where we say, look, Donald Trump is like a self-cleaning oven. He does all the work for you. So, he makes the argument whether he's good or bad. We don't have to recite all of his things. The question is, who are you? And this was sort of Biden's thing too. He used this trope pretty well, right? He would be able to say, it's not about them, it's about you, and this is just not who we are. So come and join us because you want to be part. He's not a great message bearer for evangelicals. He's a good message bearer for Catholics. He's not a bad one for evangelicals, just not a lot of the other cultural norming things that make you. He doesn't speak with the accent, right? The cultural accent that a Mike Pence or a Mike Pompeo or any of the other people in the cabinet for Trump that were all evangelicals. See, that's the thing that people don't realize, is that the Trump world was absolutely inundated with evangelicals. Like, if you're not an evangelical, you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know that Mike Pence and Pompeo and that Betsy DeVos and that the guy that was the HUD secretary, or that Jeff Sessions, like, just because if you don't look at the world through like through evangelical culturally norming categories, that stuff just passes you by. You don't even think about it. But if you're in the evangelical world, you're like, well, Trump might not be one of us, but everyone around him is. And that tells us that this community matters. I mean, I know we're not talking about that now, but our fundamental argument is that evangelicals, like every other group, they don't need their president to be like them, but they do want their president to like them. And so if you can give off the attitude that you like them and you respect them, and even if you don't agree with them, they don't care about that. Jerry Falwell Jr. didn't care that Donald Trump was nothing like him. He's just like, he's on our side, man. He thinks we matter, so we're in. That's super, super important, because that's part of the community formation piece, right? That is, how is this person part of my community and doesn't want to hurt me, doesn't want to attack me, doesn't believe me or think like I do, doesn't matter. So that's what we realize that we're up against. And this is true sort of across the board in lots of, how people find themselves in a cultural norming space. So that's the psychological side of the work we're doing. Like, how do we help people feel like, so we say there's three things that we do. We try to give people new information. So what's something that they didn't, because we think people have to have all three of these, not necessarily in this order, but all three of these elements have to exist. They need new information to have something that feels, substantively different. Like, so people would say things like, well, I voted for Trump because I just couldn't do Hillary. And I just thought maybe some disruption, we needed to try. But then and they fill in the blank, put kids in cages, said there's good people on both sides, held up a Bible when he's, cleared the thing, was so crass, people around him were colluding with Russia, whatever it is, like, pick a thing. They just needed some piece of information to free them up. Then secondly, they needed an invitation to act on that information. So they needed someone to say, you can make a change. Because very few of us, in any kind of personal, behavioral, habitual change, which is what we think all this is culture breaking habitual pattern change. What gets someone to like stop doing a thing or start doing a thing that they weren't doing previously? That's really tough. And usually someone in your world says, hey, maybe it's time to stop drinking, or maybe getting a little more exercise would be good for you, or maybe, not spending time with these people would benefit you in your life. Like someone has to suggest something, some kind of invitation that feels like, oh yeah, I can now respond to an external stimuli to act, right? Really, really important. Sometimes connected information that matters to them, sometimes not. But then the third is a community of participation. So in other words, when someone says, oh, I want to make a change and not drink or exercise more, they're like, well, you could come to the club with me, or hey, I know Fridays and Saturdays are difficult, so you could come to we have a group that meets, you could be part of the group. Like that is super important. And when you're a religiously cultured evangelical somewhere in America, and you decide to break from that norm, and you start looking around at your church or the people in your town or the people at your coffee shop, you're like, who am I going to talk to? Who do I know? It's really powerful. And the reason we know that works is because we know those are the very same elements that you use to get someone engaged. And that's exactly what the religious right has been doing for 40 years, right? Is giving people what I think is inaccurate information, compelling them with, altar call like invitation to come, and then surrounds them with a community of people, whether that's radio stations, TV, online groups, magazines, all of it. There's a very robust community of participation. So we know that you have to have all those. So trying to just help people see that.
And feel it, it sounds like, too. I mean, for it to exist, for there to be a community that's still your people, but just voting a different way.
Yeah. So if I could I'll give you an example. We were with, two of them with older folks. We were in Pennsylvania, and we were doing this, people that are telling their stories for this Hindsight 2020. And we met a woman who was in her mid 50s, and she said, so my mom is going to not vote for Donald Trump this time. She said, what happened is between 2016 and now, my dad died. And so now my mom is free to vote for who she wants. Because she said, I asked my mom, did you vote for Donald Trump? And she said, well, I didn't want to, but your dad really needed me to. And I knew he wasn't doing well. And I love him more than I care about this stuff. So I did what he asked. And then I said to her, would you think your mom would be willing to tell her story to us, either in print or do audio or video recording? She said, oh, no, there's no way. I asked her about this, and she said she wouldn't. And when I said, well, Mom, how come? She said, well, honey, because on Tuesdays, I go to Dunkin' Donuts and have donuts with my friends. I'm not giving that up. Like, this woman knew if she told her story, she was going to lose that group. And she's like, I'm in my 80s. I'm not giving up Dunkin' Donuts on Tuesdays.
Yeah.
So we're very sensitive to that reality, that people feel it, and they don't feel it like I feel better about who I voted for. Like, I don't know, does anybody ever feel good about who they voted for? I mean, I felt really good when I voted for Hillary Clinton on election day in 2016. That was sort of a motive to me. But most of the time, you can't ever compare, like, I cast a vote. It's like going to the DMV for most people, it's their civic duty that they're fulfilling. This other thing of like, I did a good, right thing, and my community tells me that. That's what keeps people hooked in.
How do you deal with the whole question of abortion and gay marriage, and that's so important to a lot of people on the left, and that I understand is complicated for a lot of evangelicals and Catholics?
Yeah, I mean, both those issues have been made into political issues, and they don't serve very well as a political issue. They're a stand-in. They're really a culture wars thing, right? They're trying to accomplish a reality in our world that is that we use politics to achieve, but they're really not particularly political. Um, in other words, they indicate something more than they carry power themselves. So I've talked to hundreds of people who say that abortion is they'll even use a phrase like, I'm a single issue voter.
Yeah,
Abortion is
no,
it,
it's right here too, right.
And, I know people for whom they are single issue voters, truly, and abortion is the issue, but they are so rare. And so
Hmm.
I've asked hundreds of people, I've said, well, look, just do a thought experiment with me. I did this a lot in 2019 and 2020. If you turned on your radio tomorrow or opened your news feed and you saw an article that said that Joe Biden came out and said, look, I had an epiphany overnight. The Mother Mary herself visited me and I've changed my view on abortion. I now am a pro-life candidate. I said, would you consider voting for him? And to a person, they've all said, no, because then I'd have to talk about taxes and guns and gay marriage. I'm like, okay, so let's just agree abortion matters to you, but it's not the only thing that matters. What is it? It's the thing that makes you feel most heroic. You're saving babies in your mind. Literally nothing more heroic than that, right? You turned your vote, not even for president, even your vote for like a mayor of your town who has nothing to do with abortion at all, into your heroic act to save babies, right? Because we'd be on the campaign trail and moving around and people would yell at us all the time, what about the babies? Like, okay, I get it. Like that's your hero's battle cry. So recognizing that people utilize those issues for something more important, which is their identity, that they're the hero.
Right.
So the way we treat the issue is to say, hey, if you want to engage in any other information about this, we'd love to talk about it, because we have a big, long developed piece of material about abortion that we suggest there's more like 5 and maybe 8 positions on abortion in the United States, not 2. That's really helpful to some people. But the only way that someone moves away from voting according to abortion, and by the way, it's the same with people who are pro-choice.
Oh, for sure.
They just swap out women's, the right of women. I'm going to protect women's health. Now I'm the hero, right? So it's, it's sort of how it works. So we offer some new information, but what we really have to do is try to say to people, is it possible for you to change your vote and not lose your hero status? That's the work. And it is. Once people realize, oh yeah, maybe who I vote for isn't the only thing that's going to affect, this issue. But it's because these are people voting for president, knowing that the president's going to do very little about this issue. We'll see what happens, after the Supreme Court rules the way it does. And gay marriage is the same way. And now gay marriage has shifted. It's not so much gay marriage now; it's this transgender kid thing.
Right.
And again, who's the greater hero here? So we're sensitive about like what we think works on this. What we do know is that what people have to see is members of a community saying, I can see myself voting for Democrats or for, in some cases, Joe Biden, in this case. And I still hold that I'm a good person.
Yeah.
Because that's what people have been told over and over and over. So that's sort of how we, most political issues for people are moral issue stand-ins. They're not really about, they don't really even know, they don't know like if someone does know and they understand the law and they understand how it plays out. And, but these are people that think that, doctors are deciding to abort babies while a mother is delivering the child because Donald Trump told them that's what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So they don't know anything about, stages of viability or how many weeks, or they don't understand why it's 15, why there's this new court case around 15 weeks as opposed to 24 weeks. It's nowhere in their psyche. And the other thing I'll often ask people, I'm like, well, this being your number one issue, I'm sure you're deeply involved in like crisis pregnancy centers, which are the alternatives to Planned Parenthood. So it's what the pro-life side does. They fund these pregnancy crisis centers to help adoption happen. Well, Sam, I'm sure you're very involved in that. You probably give a lot of money to those groups and everything. And people are always like, no, actually, I don't. And you say, okay, so it's the major moral crisis of our age, according to you. And the only thing you've ever done is not vote for a Democrat. That's how you've responded to what your people call a genocide. Like, so there's a real mismatch there, but when you meet someone who's like, no, I work at the crisis pregnancy center and I do donate money, then you're like, okay, fair enough. You're untouchable on this. It's, you're not open to changing at all. Of all the people we've talked to or been talked to by them, they reach out to us and remind us how evil we are. A fraction, and I know a lot of people in that crisis pregnancy world, and they'll often say things like, boy, if all these people who say that this is their number one issue would actually help us out a little bit, we wouldn't be fundraising all the time. They feel very unsupported. So it's a real there's no cost to being, and the same thing with, being on some moral issue that they can rise above. Yeah.
What about the work that you're doing with politicians? What do you do in the workshops? I read an article of yours where you were saying it's a good thing that, and then I couldn't find it again, of course. It's a good thing. It will help that Biden is a Catholic, but it won't be enough. And so I'm curious, what do you do in that work?
Our fundamental work is to help Democratic politicians feel comfortable saying that they want the vote of evangelicals and Catholics. And you would think that's not a thing you would have to do. I was
going to wonder, why is that a problem?
It's an amazingly high cost thing to do. There is so much pressure on Democratic politicians to not cater to the religious right and to the political right. Some of that's ideological. Some of it is that people are just like, don't waste your time. Some people think these folks don't deserve, like they're in the basket of deplorables. They don't deserve any outreach at all. We need to have a country that moves on without them and leaves them behind. There is a don't give an inch to those people argument inside of Democratic politics that runs very strong. So first bit of work is to screen out if candidates are willing to work with reaching out to these voters and take them seriously. And then we say, here's how you can do that based on values and based on who you are in your own personal story. So we get into their own story, help them figure that out, and help them find the thing they can say that says to evangelicals and Catholics, I might not agree with you, but I do like you and respect you. Mm-hmm. And usually you don't say that, that comes across a little thick. So there's other ways, and we coach them up on how you do that. Like meet a pastor in your district, or find some in your state if you're running statewide. Have a good conversation with them, and then tell your story about having a good conversation with them. Say, it's interesting. I was talking to, Pastor Hendricks, and he's over at First Baptist Church. And, we don't agree on a lot of things, but his people in his church are the same people that I represent. And we said, hey, what if we worked like that? Right there you go. Right. That's all you have to do. As opposed to, I don't know who that person is. I don't know what they want. I'm pretty sure they're dangerous. And they're the evil one. So that breaking the silence between the two groups is an enormously important piece. And we work with a representative named Katie Porter, who's in California, and she tends to be on the more politically progressive side of things. She is so good at this. She goes to evangelical churches all the time. She did it before she was a candidate. She'd go meet the pastors. She'd hang out in the lobby and say oh, I just feel like our groups never get to know each other. And I just wanted to say hi to all of you and let you know that, if you vote for me, I see you and I know this church is in my district and it matters to me. Because she's like, anywhere there's going to be 1,000 people getting together every week, I'm going. I'm not just going to the farmer's market. There's a place over there and they have coffee and donuts in the lobby, and I'm going to go say hi. So, and she's nowhere close to being, suspect of being too moderate, so we help them like see how people do it, and then help them just adjust some of their language. So here's an example that people might connect to. We were in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and a woman was running for Congress who had been a state senator. She was currently a state senator and wasn't running for re-election. We do our events. They were themed faith, hope, and love for a change on election day. Okay. And so they're designed to be sort of religiously communicating political things, outdoor rally, sort of deal. And she was a great candidate. And she said, hey, we all have our stump speeches, especially at this point in the campaign, we're all wound up in our stump speeches. And she said, but I feel it's really great being at this faith, hope, and love themed one, because I get to add something into my speech that I normally don't say. And that is that growing up, my mom was our pastor. And so I grew up as a pastor's kid, and and she goes on. And then later she said, I've been door knocking through the district here, and I keep meeting all these people at the door that say, well, I'm a Christian, so I vote for Republicans. She said, I just don't understand that. Maybe we can change that. And I'm sitting in the back thinking, I understand it. You've been an elected representative and have never told anybody that you grew up with a pastor as a mom. She wouldn't have done that if, her dad had been a labor organizer. She wouldn't have done that had her mom been in the Marines. But she had an intuition in Wisconsin. It's a political liability as a Democrat to tell people that your parent was a pastor. So we're trying to work through, like, if we're working through the psychology with voters of what makes them feel like they're behaving in ways that are not consistent with their beliefs and values, what's going on with Democratic candidates? So it's so interesting as we talk with people about this, they're like, well, it's kind of interesting. I don't really bring this up very often. And then they tell us some little gem that I'm like, oh my gosh, that's all you need. Like, you're sitting on a gold mine. Just dust that stuff off. So what we have found is, and what's even best is when people are like, I'm not religious at all. I never grew up in it. And I've watched religion really do some harm. And we're like, that's the thing you can share. Say to people, hey, look, we've seen that religion can be really harmful in the world. I've also seen the beautiful things that it does. And what you'll have is a bunch of Catholics and evangelicals nodding their head and going, yeah, we know. Like, thanks for that. That's the world we're living in all the time. How do we pull these worlds together? And you just acknowledged it without, and we often tell this story about somebody who came to one of our events and tried to quote the Bible passage, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, and got it wrong and realized quoting it that he was messing it up. And he said, I'm really sorry. I tried to memorize that in the car on the way over, and people graciously laughed. And so he said, I'm just not religious. And I was doing my best. So people gave him a lot of space. And we talked to him later and said, hey, you never have to do that. In fact, you're fine just saying, you know what? I don't even know a Bible verse, but you know what I do know? I know that you're in my district, and I know the Bible matters to you. So I'd be glad to listen to you about the things that matter to you. That's enough. I promise you, that is enough. And just acknowledging that these are elements that are cultural framing points for people, and that they see as positive cultural framing points. Right? When you're in secular culture, you think that religion is something you're trying to shed, and when you're in religious culture, you think religion is something you're trying to conserve. So people really just misunderstand each other as to what they think the motivations are. So that's what we do with candidates. And then we give them some of our training. We have lots of tips on how do you talk about sensitive social issues. How do you, if somebody wants to be sort of religiously informed about how you can talk about something like abortion or capital punishment or guns or something, people often be like, I'm not going to quote Bible verses, but it would just be good to kind of know, like, how do you religious people talk about these issues? Like, okay, here's how you can do it in a way that feels good for you. So, and then we make a lot of connections. We introduce candidates to people in their district who are faith leaders and kind of do the matchmaking of that relationship.
I know we just have a couple more minutes, but I mean, sort of in terms of helping our readers, helping people who are on the left and who tend to probably be making it hard for these Democratic candidates to go across this divide. I wonder if there's what you can say would be helpful for us. And what I had prepared for you was much longer, but just sort of, I've been reading Thomas Frank, What's the Matter with Kansas, and then his new, 2020 history of anti-populism. And he says that it's a tradition of quasi-aristocratic scorn that has allowed the paranoid right to flower so abundantly. And I wonder what you think about that. Do you think people are feeling condescended to?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, that is, when it came out that Hillary Clinton had said, hey, don't be hard on all the Republicans. There's three groups, 2/3 that are legitimate political partners, and then there's a basket of deplorables. A lot of these people took on deplorables as a badge of honor because they're like, I knew it. That's what we've been saying you were saying about us all along. I was in a room where Donald Trump said to a bunch of faith voters at the Faith and Freedom Forum, they are attacking me because they hate me, and they only hate me because I like you. That's what he told them. And people just erupted, right? So yes, people absolutely. Okay, so another little story. In 2018, I guess it was, maybe 17, just after the Republicans passed the tax bill, Trump came to Minnesota on tax day to tout how much money people were getting back in their taxes. That was the same period of time that he was attacking Ilhan Omar, and she's my congresswoman where I live. And so he came sort of to this area, and it sort of a self-organized response to him being in town came together. On one side of the small little road where he was going to a factory was a group of Ilhan Omar supporters, a couple of hundred. And on the other side of the small little, small, not even, 2-lane road, so 40 feet over, a bunch of Trump supporters with their signs out because that's where his car was going to drive through. And these two groups then are yelling at each other, right? And at the time I was running a radio show on a AM radio station here. So I went out to interview people on both sides. And when I was on the Trump side, the thing that people on both sides of the street said was, pointing across the street at the other people, I would say, like, what are you doing here? What's your experience? What are you feeling? They would say, well, first off, I have no idea who those people are. Like, we all live close enough to drive to this little spot. We're all right here. We look like each other, but I have no idea who those people are. Like, they're as foreign to me as you can get. So that's one thing. Trump people all said that. And then they also, nearly all of them, said some version of, and you know what? I'm not a bad person for supporting Trump. And I would say, well, I didn't say you were a bad person. Who said you're a bad person? And they would say, they did, the media does, my kids do. But that's where I really tapped into, hey, these people feel like they're the hero and they're being called the villain, and they really need to not be the villain. So this idea that they've been looked down on, that hits really close to home, that they are seen as stupid. They're seen as unsophisticated. Liberals don't like me. You don't think I'm good, and all that stuff. I mean, that is just, that is the fuel that drives that engine. No doubt about it. It's the biggest thing. And the advice we give to people in other professions is, do the best you can to help people not compare one side's best against the other side's worst. So we tend to do this in society, right? We tend to look at the very best of what our view of the world is and contrast it with the other person's limit, but rather to speak of your own limitations, and that the other side actually has some real benefits. There's some things they get right. There's some things they know and understand. There's some things that matter to them. So some of our work comes from David Lakoff's work and some of the other, right, of trying to say, look, there's of the 4 or 5 kind of big cluster groups culturally that there are in society, because it's not just liberal and conservative, it's super progressives and more moderates and more moderate conservatives, and then more fundamentalist conservatives. And then there's a 5th category, which is this sort of, authoritarian side that Trump has really tapped into. So Trump has really tapped into the authoritarianism, punch him in the face, kick him in the throat, clear him, throw him in jail, don't be so, all that stuff. There's a whole part of our society that loves that cowboy stuff, and that's a big piece of those, like, I didn't vote, but I'll vote for this guy crowd. That's who that is, as it turns out. So we just think that you don't touch that one, the Unite the Right side, the Proud Boys, that whole group. There's not a lot of, we've done a lot of work with those people, but we're not trying to convert any of them or helping them cross over. Just trying to understand. It's the other groups that, there's something important to them, and to see what is that thing that's important to them. What's the So that's the advice that we give to people is look, we all organize our understanding of ourselves in quirky ways. And if you put any of our self-understandings under too close of a spotlight, it starts to shine pretty thin, doesn't make a lot of sense. So what people are doing is a very complex balancing act, trying to hold it all together. So a little bit of kind of empathy for just how hard it is to be somebody with that view. And that's, we try as an organization. It's hard, right? Because you don't want to be
somebody with what view?
With a view where you're supporting, Trumpism in the world.
I see.
It's when you really talk to people who support Trump or Republicans like him, once they sort of get over the defensiveness and the bravado, they really feel, like, you don't know how hard it is to have to vote for such a flawed tool of, such a flawed vessel. Like, somehow they become a victim in this thing, right? It's just amazing, like incredible. So, but that's real, right? That is a real experience that the person has. They just feel they don't have any other options. And when you're so out of options, you'll believe a rainmaker when one comes around and makes promises to you.
Right.
And that's a difficult place to be in. So that deep empathy is what we do. We don't tell politicians to do that, and we don't suggest that groups of victimized peoples do that, so, like, we don't say to LGBTQ, especially to transgender groups, like, hey, have a little empathy for the right. They don't have to offer that, but other people that are in the mix, we say to them, help folks that you work with sort of see that, because for a lot of us, politics it's an ill-fitting suit anyway, you just like, yeah, I mean, rarely does somebody find a politician that's like, boy, I just, don't have a care in the world about voting for this person. Everything feels great, Right. It's a little misfitting in the first place.
I think it's so interesting, and I know we have to stop this thing of the community aspect of it. I mean, yeah. I think that seems like that's something very much, and I know Ben Sass is big on this, that, I mean, having been through the pandemic in New York City, I mean, just people are so isolated, but I think there was a lot of us that were very isolated before. And this question of a group that manages to, I mean, your Solomon's Porch, it sounded like an amazing community that you pulled together. And it seems like in what you're saying, there's a lot to be very deeply respectful of. And we could probably stand to do a little more of that.
Yeah, and to realize, that people form these communities that do really good things, um, and there's a little poison in the water, so you've got to figure that out, and what do you do? Because what what organized group doesn't? And I'm not trying to play, the whataboutisms, but it just kind of comes with the package. You get a bunch of people together, you organize for a purpose and a goal, and somewhere in there, something isn't quite
Yeah.
quite square. Yeah, that's. But look, Mike Pence has this. He's one who tends to utilize a phrase that's very popular in the the conservative religious, and therefore even white evangelical group, where he will say, "Look, I am a Christian, conservative, Republican in that order."
Hmm.
And that in that order is really important, right? Because it's a community framing ethos. So he's saying, what's first? My faith. So if you attack my politics, fundamentally, you're going to be attacking my faith. Unbelievably genius and diabolical way to organize. And then he says, I'm conservative, and that's different than being a Republican. And then finally, I'm a Republican. Now, most of us look at these people and we're like, no, I think you're a Republican who's a Republican. And then after that, then you're a Republican, right? You don't care at all. You'll just vote for Republicans no matter who they are. Turns out that's probably true, but that's not the self-narrative. The internal narrative is my faith, and then my political framing, and then my party association. That's important. That's part of the reason that we keep, I am hard pressed to feel very good about about identifying as an evangelical. Like, what in the world would I do that for? What good is that? Well, it's because there's people for whom they're unwilling to give up that identity quite yet, and they don't want to stand in a room alone, right? So I'm like, okay, it's in that sense, it's kind of a freebie, and I've spent a lot of years trying to, not make that. I've never used that before this work. I never used that as a category. I wasn't raised in it. I fit the prototype perfectly, but I didn't care. I never used it. It wasn't a but it's like being a Midwesterner. Like, I don't go around and saying to somebody, I'm a Midwesterner, like, it doesn't make any sense. If I go to another country and they say, where are you from? I don't say the Midwest. I use other categories. But I use it now because it has so much political cachet. I thought evangelicalism as a political force was going to end after 2008. I was pretty sure it was waning and was gone. And a lot of us thought that, and we were dangerously wrong. And it has real consequence to the planet. So I've decided, 40 years ago, you could be an evangelical and vote for a Democratic evangelical president from Georgia,
Right.
Jimmy Carter. So 40 years from now, maybe that won't be, and to just turn it over to a bunch of, hyper fundamentalist QAnon supporting, folks is not it turns out that's probably not yet a safe plan. We probably shouldn't. Maybe we declared that pandemic was over a little too soon as well, right? So trying to create some sense that there's a community that people don't have to lose that Christian identity. And look, I'm very comfortable saying to somebody I'm a Christian. It has nothing to do with being evangelical. But for a lot of people, those are synonyms.
Right.
They don't use it as an adjective. They use it as a synonym. So to not make people give up their religious identity or self identity is important. And then you can move on to being conservative or progressive or whatever sort of political space, and then a political party after that is really important. But if you come at politics as your identity framing thing, then you might be a Republican or a Green Party member or a Libertarian or a Republican first. And then you have your other, so I know a lot of people are like, no, look, I'm a Republican who's kind of moderate, and I happen to go to an Episcopal church. That's how I think about, they just invert that order of importance. Or I stop religion altogether, at another stage of life. And that's a lot of people too. It just turns out more people are the other way around. Like, truly, in this country, religion carries a greater level, and it has nothing to do with attending church, by the way. Like, the thing that people get confused about all the time is they're like, but I thought churches were declining. In fact, the majority of people who identify as an evangelical don't go to church. Mm-hmm. So this is the other thing, that depending on which polling group the material is coming from, you get radically different categories of how many evangelicals there are and Catholics. Because some groups, PRI, they tend to attach a behavior to if someone is an evangelical or not. So they'll say, like, look, if you don't go to church and you don't read your Bible and you don't do a thing, you're not an evangelical. And people don't care if they're granted that. They're like I know people that live in California and have lived there for 35 years, and they'll still say, I was raised in the Midwest. I'm a Midwesterner, I got Iowa values, but I'm living out here, and it's like that with church. Like, it's not if people go there, is that how they identify, and do they have some deep core sensibility? Like, we know that many of the people on the very hard right haven't gone to church for decades, but they're really religiously conservative. In fact, they're so conservative they can't find a church to go to in their town, so they don't go at all, right? Mm. So if they're polled up and somebody calls them and says, do you attend a church? Do you do? Then they'd be like, well, no, those are not evangelical. So the languaging around how many there are is really inaccurate. So in your world, and then if someone even says, like, oh no, I grew up evangelical, but I'm not evangelical anymore, and then you start to peel away like what motivates their life. And if you didn't have that category, you're like, boy, it sounds an awful lot like somebody that has this cultural frame. So that's that. Because you're talking about root core cultural stories that frame someone's sense of identity, it's not as easy as someone just saying, I'm not Catholic, I'm not a Jew, I'm not a evangelical anymore. Like, those just don't work.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah, well, you're sure welcome. Thanks for caring about this. What is it about all this you think that'll connect with your community of people and that are wanting, what do you think there is that they are interested in?
I think all of it. I think it's just super interesting. For sure. I think there is huge amounts of my own particular church. It was an Episcopal. I worked in a religious community right out of college, and then when I raised my kids, we just went to the local Episcopal church. And after 9/11, a bunch of evangelicals came into our church, and I was horrified. We went with the Quakers for a bunch of years, and and then
they're in New York.
Yeah, in New York.
And at the Society of Friends building there, is that?
Yeah. That's right where we live.
God, I love that place.
It's really nice. And then eventually we went back to the church where we were before, and I started to get to know these people, and I was like, these guys are just as serious about transformation and growth as I am about the same. And I've always had this interest in depth in religion. I majored in it in college. It was a big feature in my life growing up. Not like my family hated it, but I was just curious about it. And so once I was attuned to that even a little bit, I've been very annoyed and worried by the I mean, nobody would make a racially insensitive comment,
Right.
but it's just fair game to be utterly dismissive. And I just think that's not right on so many levels and hugely politically dangerous. So
Yeah.
I have a cousin who's used to be an evangelical, and she told me about your work, and I've been following it since 2018.
Oh,
And since
wow.
now that I'm doing this magazine, I thought, give it a try. And
Great.
so I have 1,500 words only, so I'll have to edit
Sure.
heavily.
Right.
But it just seems like it's really worth it to try to help people see that they can be dismissive and that has consequences, and that if you could, there's a lot you could learn. Why narrow your world so much?
Yeah, I think that's exactly how we're thinking about it. And sometimes we think in 4-month windows, like before an election. Sometimes we're in 4 years, like after Trump's election, we're thinking that way. And we also try to think in this 40-year window, like what will it take to make these kinds of cultural shifts? Because it didn't used to be this way. And if it didn't used to be like this, it's probably this way because someone made it this way. And if someone made it this way, then we can change it. There's nothing here that makes some sort of logical or, I don't know, societal sense that you're like, well, you're not going to change that. Like, there's just, like I'm come from the pacifist, non-militaristic side of the Christian tradition. I'm like, but America, the United States, is never not going to be militaristic. Like that is built into its ethos, its founding documents. It's like, I was even shocked that new citizens who have to take the naturalization oath have to say, I will submit myself to being in the military. Like, it is so ingrained. So we have to be a voice of, counter, conscience to a system that's going to be there. But I don't think evangelicals voting for authoritarian, cruel Republicans is a necessity. Like, it totally doesn't have to be that way. And there's certainly no reason that religious people lean toward Republicans, and they do across the board. Trump picked up Muslim voters in 2020.
That's crazy.
Made gains with Muslim voters after the Muslim ban.
Because of the why?
Oh, the people that I know who do this work are still trying to figure that out. Like, there's, we have counterpart groups in lots of this world, and they're like, we don't know how we moved from 11% to 17%, but that's shocking. And gained with, charismatic, with Latino voters in many states in the country.
That was the one other thing I was going to ask you. How effective do you think you're being?
Just barely effective enough. So our work, like, we know that the people we can influence are clustered around the country in certain places. Fortunately, they're in places where we can have electoral college impact. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, especially. Evangelicals and religious voters overall over-index in those places and are of the kind of religious voters that are movable. So, in fact, only 2 counties in all of Michigan actually switched their overall vote from 2016, and those were Kent County and Grand Rapids County, so, which are heavily populated by evangelicals. So evangelicals swung Michigan. Catholics swung Pennsylvania, and we know where it happened and the towns and all that. And Michigan was Wisconsin was a hodgepodge, but without faith voters in Wisconsin, that wouldn't have switched either. So, are we making any impacts in Louisiana and Georgia and maybe North Carolina or South Florida? Nope. Are we making any impacts in Texas? Maybe. It's a little hard to tell, but they just got overwhelmed with, so many Republicans turned out in Texas. Maybe Orange County and parts of, the Valley in California, a little bit of movement. So overall, probably a 4% swing, but in Michigan and hang on a minute, I got to stop a call. I was trying to make a call go away, and I pushed the wrong end and accept button.
It's all the time.
There we go. So, and that's also kind of important, right? Is that evangelicalism is not the same all around the country. When it comes to the big category of what we mean when we say evangelical, that has been when you're an insider in the industry, it's been a debate that's raging for decades. Nobody else should care about it. It's an internal argument we're having. But it matters in this sense that I think there's 3 major groups. One are fundamentalist Baptists, some of which would be the Southern Baptists, but it's kind of the Jerry Falwell crowd, right? Then there's the charismatic Pentecostal group. So this would be Pat Robertson and that crowd. There's a big magazine a lot of those people read called Charisma Magazine. And then the third group are these kind of non-denominational evangelicals. So Wheaton College, Taylor University, lots of Christian college university stuff. And Christianity Today magazine is kind of the magazine of that, National Association of Evangelicals. Of the, whatever you put the number at, 70 million, 50, 100 million, somewhere in that ballpark of people in the country is that. There's 3 distinct groups in there, right? And the third group I identified, that non-denominational church, Christian college, Christianity Today crowd, are the most movable. In fact, almost all the movement that we saw away from Trump came from that group. The fundamentalist Baptists, the sort of really difficult to move. And the charismatics used to be more movable, but Trump really played hardcore to them. And that's actually where all of the Hispanic, Latino move toward Trump is coming from, are people in those particular kinds of churches. So when you're in this work doing what we're doing, like we're dividing up like the plant varieties, like Christmas trees here. We're like, no, we're going to go with the balsam. That's the only thing we're picking this year, are the balsams, because those are what we know are going to work. So we're in it at that level. That's part of the reason why Pennsylvania and Michigan and maybe Iowa and Wisconsin are movable, where the South and the charismatic corridors of this world are not as movable. So when we're working with candidates, we're like, look, you're in an area that's just really dominated by charismatic Pentecostals. You're going to have a harder time getting any of those people to vote for you. Or we'll say, hey, you're in a place that's really dominated by a significant Christian college thing, so in Iowa, that's the case. We think Iowa is actually going to be movable because we've done a lot of work with some those Christian college communities, Dutch background. So like we're in at that level, right? Like, and that matters. So when someone says, "Oh, I'm an evangelical," they might mean I'm a fundamentalist Baptist, or they might mean I'm a charismatic Pentecostal, or they might mean, I'm like the guy who is the former head of the National Institute of Health, who just, I'm speaking of. He just resigned. He just retired. Anyway, he's one of those evangelicals, like from that category, So how effective are we being? Extremely effective in 1/3 of the group. And we refer to it as acupunctural intervention. We're like, if we can get into this nerve root right here, we're acupuncture people, trying to make a small our joke is that a small hinge can open a really big door. So we're trying to work in that small space to move those people and have enough impact. Because you're talking about 3%, 2-3% of a population's shift when it's this big can really cause a difference. So that's the kind of work we're doing, but that's very tenuous. This is building with matchsticks. Like it can all blow over in a minute. And we thought the Biden administration was going to do some things that would make future outreach to these voters and to candidates easier for us in the work we're doing. That hasn't been the case. So we're just going to have to work without that benefit. So
again, thank you so much. This is
of
really
course
amazing, and I will certainly send you whatever I pulled together just so you can see it ahead of time.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay. Stay in touch. Okay.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.